Welcome to Discovering the Law. My name is Lucy Rivera and I am the host of this program. This episode can be viewed at www.discoveringthelaw.com. Today we have a very special guest. We have Honorable Judge Mitch Sikora, who was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts. He is a product of public school systems, his favorite being the Boston Latin School. Judge Sikora enjoyed and played basketball and baseball for college and during his high school years. And during his childhood, he did the paper route, he mowed lawns, and he worked at warehouses. Judge Sikora has a 24-year experience as an attorney, 10 years in the Superior Court of Massachusetts, and 8 years in the Appeals Court. Welcome to our program, Judge Sikora.
Thank you for inviting me, Lucy.
We're proud and we're honored to have you today.
It's my privilege.
Your Honor, how does the Appeals Court fall in the Massachusetts structure of the judicial system?
Well, the Massachusetts system, like most states in the federal system, is a pyramid. And at the base of the pyramid, we have 7 trial courts consisting of 360 judges. And then halfway or 3/4 of the way up the pyramid, we have the Appeals Court. It consists of 25 judges. And at the top of the pyramid, we have the Supreme Judicial Court, which consists of 7 justices. And if someone loses a case in any of the 7 trial courts, the loser has a right automatically to take an appeal to the Appeals Court. In the Massachusetts system, there are almost 30,000 cases at any given time. And those cases begin in one of the 7 trial courts. The major trial court is the Superior Court. There are 82 judges in the Superior Court, and the Superior Court hears all criminal cases which will involve more than 2.5 years of imprisonment if someone is found guilty. It hears all civil cases in which the damages could amount to more than $25,000. So the Superior Court is the major trial court. The second best known trial court is the District Court. It consists of 160 or so judges, and it takes all cases of a criminal nature in which the penalty is less than 2.5 years, and all cases of a civil nature in which the damages are below $25,000. There are other courts. The Boston Municipal Court is essentially a district court which sits in Boston, and its jurisdictional amounts are the same as the district court. Then there is the Family and Probate Court, which consists of about 50 judges, and they handle matters of divorce, child custody, trusts, estates, and will contests. Then there is the Juvenile Court, which handles matters involving minors, that is children, 16 years or below. Then there are 2 other courts that involve real property. The Housing Court, consisting of 3 or 4 courts around the state, which handle disputes between landlords and tenants. There are about 20 judges in the Housing Court. And another court called the Land Court. And the Land Court handles disputes involving real property, in which people are having fights over boundaries or easements, ownership of land. So those are the 7 trial courts from which the cases come up the pyramid to the Appeals Court. The Appeals Court gets about 2,000 appeals per year. It must take and decide those 2,000 appeals. It has 25 judges, and each judge will sit on approximately 240 cases per year as part of a 3-judge panel that hears cases. There are 8 3-judge panels sitting every month, September through June. Now, if you want to go beyond the Appeals Court, you generally have to ask for permission, and you have to ask the Supreme Judicial Court whether you can come to the top of the pyramid because you have a special issue that is publicly important, that is very significant. And the state Supreme Court, the Supreme Judicial Court, takes about 175 cases a year. So you have the trial courts, 360 judges, and they have about 28,000 cases. You have the Appeals Court, 25 judges, and it hears about 2,000 cases, and you have the Supreme Judicial Court, 7 judges, and it hears about 175 cases a year. So if you keep in mind the pyramid, you'll understand the system.
That's very interesting, Judge Sikora. What would be the next further review from the appeals court?
Well, you would have to ask the Supreme Judicial Court, and you would file what is called a petition for further appellate review. It's known as an FAR petition, FAR. And so if I lost in the appeals court, I would prepare a petition and file it with the Supreme Judicial Court and say, the appeals court got it wrong. I have a very important case, very little precedent, general significance, and here is my petition, and here is how I think the Supreme Judicial Court, rather the appeals court, made a mistake, and I ask you to hear my case. Now, that happens about 20, 25 times a month, and the Supreme Judicial Court turns down the great majority of petitions for further appellate review. Maybe 2 or 3 times a year, it will take or 2 or 3 times a month, it will take a petition for further appellate review. There is one kind of case that goes directly to the Supreme Judicial Court, first-degree murder convictions. There are certain other cases that will go there also, for example, cases involving utility rates set by major utilities such as electric power companies, telecommunications companies. Those cases are deemed very important and can go directly to the Supreme Judicial Court.
Your Honor, what is the significance of the Massachusetts court in the history of the United States?
Well, Massachusetts has been a leading jurisdiction throughout the history of the United States, and even before the formation of the United States in colonial times. Massachusetts had an unusually high number of lawyers. Some of them are famous. Perhaps our most famous early lawyer was John Adams. John Adams wrote the Massachusetts Constitution. He wrote it in 1779, finished it up right around December of 1779, and then it went out to all the cities and towns for approval in 1780. And in the Constitution, John Adams, who is a very brave person physically as well as a very smart lawyer, and had practiced for over 20 years, inserted the provision that judges should not be elected, that they should be appointed for life or good behavior. And he put a provision into the Constitution that permitted judges to be impeached for corruption or other serious wrongdoing. But his view was that judges should not have to run for election, because if they did, they would pander for popularity rather than decide their cases strictly on the merits. So that was an important idea, and Massachusetts adopted it and has maintained it ever since 1780. So for 235 years, we've had that system. Now, the great importance of that provision is that 7 years later, in 1787, John Adams went to the Constitutional Convention to set up the Constitution for what would be the United States. And he persuaded the delegates, including James Madison, to adopt the same system for unelected appointed judges. And so the whole federal court system copies the Massachusetts system and has judges appointed for life or good behavior. That has turned out to be very important because judges do not have to worry about being popular. They have to worry about simply getting their case right. Now, as you know, I know you're a lawyer and a student of the law, you know that John Adams represented the British soldiers who were accused of murdering civilians on State Street in 1770 as part of the Boston Massacre. Yes. And the mobs were very furious against the British soldiers and the army that was occupying downtown Boston. And he had the courage to stand up and say that they were entitled to a fair trial. He represented them, and he was able to persuade a jury that the British captain never gave the order to shoot any of the civilians. Rather, someone in the crowd had yelled fire, and the soldiers, thinking it was the commander, then fired on the civilians and killed 7 of them. but the commander, his name was Captain Preston, I believe, never gave that order, and Adams went out and found witnesses who established that fact. So he was very brave, very courageous, and he expected the same kind of courage from judges. So he was a great, great lawyer, and his influence continues today more than 200 years later. So that's the significance of the Massachusetts Constitution and judiciary. It was copied by the federal Constitution and judiciary, and it removes from the Massachusetts judge the tension between popularity and integrity.
And that's a very interesting point about John Adams and the Massachusetts history. But how does tell us your insight as to where does the Massachusetts judiciary rank among the United States, 50 states?
I would say generally most law professors and scholars view Massachusetts as one of the most important and preeminent 3 jurisdictions. If you took a vote, law professors might vote at number 1 because of the number of extraordinarily great judges who came from Massachusetts. And most of the, also there is this factor. Massachusetts has 9 law schools in a relatively small geographical area, and a great university system, more than any other area, not only in the country, but in the world. Massachusetts has universities, and universities generate law schools. So early on in colonial times and on to the present, Massachusetts is viewed as a very intellectual community in the professions, in medicine, law, engineering, science, research. So Massachusetts has this reputation of turning out great institutions and very smart people. And that applies to the law as well. And Massachusetts is generally credited with having more great judges over the last 200 years than any other jurisdiction. Now, I have to add, since I'm from Massachusetts, you could say that I was prejudiced. But I have thought carefully about this subject for many years, and I'm convinced that these views are accurate.
And the first Constitution was written here.
That's correct. The oldest Constitution in North America is the Massachusetts Constitution. And the Supreme Judicial Court can trace itself back to 1690. It was a colonial court before the formation of American independence. So it goes back literally 324 years.
And this rich history, who are the greatest jurists and judges of Massachusetts?
That's a great question. Most scholars will provide a list of about 12 judges in American history who are the most influential.
Yes.
And of those 12 judges, most professors and scholars agree that 4 of them are from Massachusetts, 3 of them are from New York, and 5 other states have 1 each. And the great judges from Massachusetts are, first of all, a man named Joseph Story, S-T-O-R-Y.
Yes.
And Joseph Story was on the United States Supreme Court from about 1815 to 1835. And he was a very profound scholar, a deep thinker, and he wrote treatises about the law, and he helped to found Harvard Law School in the 1820s. And next to John Marshall, who was the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court from 1801 to 1835, Joseph Story is regarded as the second most important Supreme Court justice for the first half of the 19th century. And he was a very gentle and scholarly person, well-liked and much admired. The second great judge in Massachusetts history is a man named Lemuel Shaw. He was Chief Justice of Massachusetts from 1830 to 1860. And Shaw was a big bear of a guy. He looked ferocious, but he was very kind and gentle, and also much admired because he had such a good temperament. And he was a prodigious worker, and he wrote long opinions about new areas of the law. And if you read his opinions today, they have a very modern sound. He wrote in very clear English. Lemuel Shaw was the first American judge to be cited regularly by the English courts, who always looked down on the colonies as being the children of English culture and law. And he was the first American judge whom English judges admired so much that they would cite him as authority for their rules. And he was very often first into an area and created the rules before even the English courts. Lemuel Shaw, if you go to the Library of Congress in Washington, across the street from the Capitol building, next to the U.S. Supreme Court building, go into the lobby and look up, and they have the names of all the great figures in different disciplines: law, medicine, philosophy, science. And you look up at the law dome, and there are 5 names up there, and one of them is Lemuel Shaw. So there's Shaw. The next great figure is Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. He was a judge in the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court from 1882 to 1902, and then he was on the United States Supreme Court for 30 additional years from 1902 to 1932. And he was a great judge who wrote many brilliant opinions, and he was one of the longest-serving judges in the history of the United States. And he was a soldier in the Civil War. He grew up in Beacon Hill and Beacon Street. His father was a famous doctor, and he was wounded 3 times in the Civil War. He lived. And he's generally regarded, along with John Marshall, to be perhaps the greatest and best known of all American judges. And he was probably the one person in history known to be in the presence of Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and Franklin Roosevelt. He was in formation as a Union soldier when Abraham Lincoln reviewed the troops in 1862. He was appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States by Teddy Roosevelt in 1902, and when he retired in his early 90s, President Franklin Roosevelt came to his house in Washington, to Holmes's house, to thank him for his service. So he contacted Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and Franklin Roosevelt. It's not known that anybody else ever had that breadth of life. The final judge I want to mention is Louis Brandeis, after whom Brandeis University is named. Louis Brandeis was a great lawyer in Boston, and he was appointed, he was known as the people's lawyer. He took up causes for progressive improvements in the law, minimum wages, reasonable hours for laborers. He invented savings bank life insurance. He taught courses at law schools. And he had great compassion, but he was brilliant. He was #1 in his class at Harvard Law School at the age of 21. He didn't go to college. He went directly to law school. He grew up in Frankfort, Kentucky, and came to Boston to go to law school. Brandeis was brilliant, very progressive and far-seeing, and he was on the United States Supreme Court from 1916 to 1939 when his health started to give out, and he retired in 1939, and he died in 1941. But he was a brilliant judge, beautiful writer, much admired, very courageous. So those are the 4 great heroic judges in Massachusetts history. We have other terrific judges whom I could mention, but these 4 judges are known worldwide. They are admired, and they are all Massachusetts people, so we're very proud of them.
Yes, and I would like to hear your opinion as to other great judges that you feel have been great in the American jurisprudence.
Sure. I mentioned that three judges from New York are regarded as among the greatest judges. And one of them is a man named Benjamin Cardozo. And he was a New York State Supreme Court judge. They call it the Court of Appeals in Albany. And he was there from, I think, about 1912 to 1932. And he wrote many great decisions. Now, as a lawyer and a law student, you remember from your first year your case books about contracts and torts. And so many decisions in those books were written by Cardozo. Yes. Cardozo was, again, another very nice man, very gentle, very scholarly. Grew up in New York City. He was a bachelor all his life, lived with his sister, took care of his sister. He was very private, and so he kept his life relatively quiet. And it was only after he died that people discovered a great deal about his private life. He had a very calm temperament, and he wrote beautifully. He wrote almost in a poetic style. He was very quotable, as you remember from the decisions that we read. Now, when Holmes had to retire in 1932 from the U.S. Supreme Court, Holmes was 91, there was a general view around the country there was only one judge good enough to take Holmes's place, and that was Cardozo. So everybody said to President Roosevelt, you have to appoint Cardozo, who was already somewhat old and beginning to have health problems. And Roosevelt knew of Cardozo because Roosevelt was a New Yorker and had been governor, had lived in Albany as governor, and everyone knew about the great Cardozo, and Roosevelt agreed. He appointed Cardozo to succeed Holmes. Cardozo's health gave out after 6 years, and he died in 1938. But he is another great judge. There's one final judge. His name is Learned Hand. Learned Hand was a New Yorker, came, I believe, Cardozo went to Columbia Law School. Learned Hand was a New Yorker but came to Harvard Law School, went back to New York, practiced for a while, and became a federal trial judge at an early age. After about 10 years as a federal trial judge, he was promoted to the Federal Court of Appeals in New York, and he was there for almost 40 years writing opinions. And he was a terrific writer. Everyone thought that he should go to the U.S. Supreme Court, but, and they recommended, especially to President Roosevelt in the 30s, that Roosevelt should appoint him to the Supreme Court. However, Roosevelt had said publicly that Supreme Court justices were generally too old and were not current enough to appreciate the needs for new legislation. And while people kept telling Roosevelt he should appoint Learned Hand to the Supreme Court, Roosevelt said, I would be contradicting myself if I did. I'm sorry, I can't do it, because I said, by then, Hand was in his 60s and 70s, and Roosevelt felt that he'd be contradicting his own principles if he appointed too old an individual to the Supreme Court. It may also have been that when Roosevelt appointed Cardozo in 1932, he felt that he would be overloading the court with New York persons, and he would look parochial because he was a New Yorker if he appointed another New Yorker to the Supreme Court. Although I have to mention right now, I think we have a large bunch of New Yorkers on the Supreme Court. People who grew up in New York City are on the Supreme Court. There may be 4 of them right now of the 9. So that's very unusual.
That's unusual.
It is. That's right.
Your Honor, what's your advice to the citizens about the court system?
Well, generally, you want to avoid going to court. The law cannot save you from yourself. And the best law advisors we have are our mothers and our fathers, who tell us to behave very carefully and very morally throughout our life. And as you know, if you think of your best teachers, grade school, high school, college, graduate school, they are always telling you to be prudent, to be wise, and to be careful, and to be decent in your dealings with other people, and to be honorable. Supposedly, Abraham Lincoln had a sign over his desk in back of his head when he was a practicing lawyer. And people forget Lincoln was a wonderful lawyer before he got into politics and became president. And Lincoln's sign said, avoid litigation. And so generally, don't count on the court system to save you from your own weaknesses. Think of your parents and your teachers and
your friends,
your good friends who give you good advice, and try to avoid legal battles. Sometimes it's impossible. Someone is nasty and they come after you and they sue you or they create controversies, and you have to go to court. But generally, a citizen should be counting on himself or herself to avoid legal disputes, behaving wisely and honorably all your life.
That is great advice, Your Honor, and we have run out of time. But to our viewers, thank you so much for watching another episode of Discovering the Law. This is Honorable Judge Mitch Sikora from the Appeals Court. This episode can be viewed at www.discoveringthelaw.com. My name is Lucy Rivera, and thank you for watching.